Aussies, scientists about bird feeding, and as Tim Lowe's put eloquently on the front cover of the book, in this international exploration of what looks like a trivial topic, and the publishers put that on the book, I understand my challenge. So let's have a go. I'd like to talk to you about bird feeding and why it might actually be significant, why we might need to have a look at it. It's very controversial in Australia. I'm not really going to talk too much about that side of things. That will come up as we go along. The first thing I want to just make a blatant statement that you're probably not aware of. People feed birds. Right, so that's happening. Let's just get that out there. But what do I mean by that? There's a couple of definitions that we need to go for. I'm not talking about when you turn up at the beach or in the park and the pigeons come or the seagulls come and you can't help but just chuck them a chip. That's not what I'm talking about. That's probably universal. Probably it's unavoidable. Even the people who have death threats to people who feed birds still feed chips to the seagulls and they can't help it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm really talking about this much more organised thing that people do when they. So, in order to qualify for bird feeding in my book, it's really about organised backyard, your place, under your control. Go out, buy food, do it regularly. That kind of thing. It's not the spontaneous type of stuff, and it's very much about the private house yards. And I just want to specify that because there's an entire other thing, which is feeding the ducks down at the pond type stuff, which can be organised and all that sort of stuff. And that's such a big, different world. I've looked at that in a whole lot of other things as well, and I've done a lot of research in that area, but that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm really talking about what happens when we feed birds in your backyard, as occurs all around the world, not the public version of that. So let's just throw up some numbers for a start. UK, 60,000 tonnes of seed is put out every year, around about, and it's a big thing. So lots and lots of seed is put out for the birds in people's backyards, and it's very strongly endorsed and encouraged by very well-established, respectable groups like the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and the British Trust for Ornithology. And on their websites it says if you care about birds, you'll put out the feed and all that sort of things. Interestingly, you can go to their shops and to their online websites and buy food for the birds endorsed by those organisations. So they're kind of mixed up in it as well, so we have to be aware of that. In the United States, it's also a very big deal. So I've got a picture of a train on the screen. There's approximately 100 carriages there. So think of every one of those, that coal coming from Adani, but instead of coal that's full of birdseed, there's 100 there. Every year in America, 22,000 carriages of seed is put out for the birds. And I don't think that's possible to actually envisage or understand at all. It's an insane amount of food that's put out there. Again, the really important ornithological groups like the Cornell Lab and all those sorts of people encourage people to feed the birds. I'm not saying it's bad or good at the moment. I'm just saying that's encouraged strongly because this really, really contrasts with Australia. It's totally different. The public attitude to feeding is really different in this country. So the participation rates, which is the proportion of households who regularly feed birds, who go out and spend money and regularly feed birds in the UK and in the US, is around this third to three-quarters, quite a lot. But in Australia, because everybody knows that you shouldn't feed birds, nobody's feeding birds. Absolute rubbish. Though everybody knows that you shouldn't feed birds in Australia, the same proportion of people are doing it as well. So there's some sociological thing going on there. This is the only country in the world where it's very actively discouraged by all the organisations, the environment organisations, the bird conservation organisations, the parks people, everybody, you all know this. You really shouldn't feed the birds, and everybody knows why. Yet, Australians still do. Absolutely conservative number, there's 3 million Australians doing this on a regular basis. knowing that you shouldn't do it. So what the hell's going on? I mean, and I don't know what the hell's going on. I don't even know, I'll come straight out and tell you now, I don't know what history led that attitude to be the prominent attitude in Australia. Because the things that people are concerned about, which we'll mention soon, are exactly the same things that people are concerned about anywhere else in the world. You know, the disease and dependency and all that sorts of things. So why Australia? Why so different? Don't know. Looking for a sociologist to help me explore that a bit. But there's a couple of things we need to say about that. So just establishing first, big deal, tons of food. Ridiculous, insane amounts of food are provided for the birds in people's backyards. But, says the robin, none of that food is actually needed. It's all completely supplementary, additional, secondarily provided. They could live without that food. Yes?
Are you talking globally or just in Australia?
Globally. Globally. This is the big, you know, these are all big story, big things for the whole world. And none of it, this is another interesting thing that people, and I didn't understand it all as well, virtually not a single one of the seeds that all those birds eat, and it's primarily the seed is the bulk thing that the birds are eating, none of those seeds were ever in the natural diet of the birds that eat it. So the birds, you know, the sunflowers and the millet and the other things that British blue tits eat by the ton were never part of their natural diet. They ate other sorts of seeds, but the actual seeds that we buy and distribute to the birds were not part of their natural diet. So there's just two interesting bits of stuff to put out there. It's all eaten. It's all eaten. They don't go, I don't know what that sunflower seed is, I'm not going to touch it. No, of course they don't. Any sensible, opportunistic bird would go, let's have a go at this stuff, it might be pretty good. Oh, it's full of oil, much more than anything else that I've got. I'm going to get stuck into it every time I see a sunflower seed, and sunflower is absolutely the most preferred seed in the world. Okay, let's go back a bit. So how did this all begin? That's a bird in the winter, you know, just a nice looking bird, but it's cold. And the traditional story is that this began in the European area where people saw desperate, starving, difficult birds in tough times in winter, and what are you going to do? You've got to respond to them somehow. So it was kind of, the general origin story is humane assistance to distressed birds in winter in Europe or anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. And there's absolutely, definitely that's part of the deal. And we've got, there's an interesting aspect in the book there where during Victorian times, in Great Britain at least, that would have been feeding the birds before that time would have been regarded as completely wasteful. You wouldn't have wasted food on birds. Every single thing that was produced in your kitchen was somehow recycled for other types of food. It would have, you know, dried bread was made into puddings. Anything else was like that. You wouldn't have wasted seed on the sparrows. That would have been terrible. But there was a period. There was an incredibly serious cold period that lasted for 6 to 8 months, depending on what part of Europe it was. And really serious numbers of starving birds turned up. And it changed during that period of time, at least in Britain, where there was endless letters to the editor and all sorts of things where people said, have you noticed the starving birds? It really is time to help them out. And there are lots of stories of unionists getting together all the breadcrumbs after lunch and taking them out onto the frozen ice of the Thames and putting them out. And from that moment it became an organised and acceptable thing to do. And there was a big change. So that's just Britain, and that's just one little anecdote to show where it came from. But it's been around for a really long time. But I did some delving and found some other just, you know, quaint and interesting things. This was, at the time, this was what I thought was the earliest version of organised bird feeding. You'll recall that the Egyptians were very big into their animal-styled gods, and so we had the ibis god, Thoth, and there were huge, because Thoth was recorded when the jackal-headed god weighed your soul before you were sent across the Styx. Your the jackal-headed gull would wave your soul, and he would tell Thoth, the ibis god, what the result was, and it was either good or bloody bad. And he wrote it down. So he's the god of writing and recording and all those sorts of things. Now you wanted him on your side, and so Thoth mummies were in their hundreds of thousands produced for wealthy families to go into the burial chambers in Egypt. Now, where do you get ibis from? You know, so that there was a huge industry, a religious industry based around providing seed out in fields for the ibises to come in and get collected, and we don't know how, that's not recorded how they collected them, but they collected them in gigantic numbers. And Saqqara there, which is mentioned, was supplying 100,000 ibis mummies per year just for that area, and there were many, many other places where that was occurring. So that was a big deal. And we've actually got some people working at Griffith now on the ancient DNA of the ibis to see, because there's seriously large numbers of ibis mummies available for researchers, which is happening. But I gave a talk like this somewhere just to a bird group, and somebody came up afterwards and said, there is another example of this kind of thing as well that you need to be aware of. And Bhatiyana is an orthodox Hindu ritual, which is all about, this is a completely different motivation. It's all about overcoming the negative karma that you have acquired during the last little while. And so what that means is, there are things that you did that you may not even been aware of. You might have stood on an ant, slapped a mosquito. You might have done some things which generated a bit of bad karma. You can overcome that by the first thing next day, even the things that you are not aware of, by providing sustenance for the celestial beings. And that included birds. And so what this practice was providing just a little bit of stuff, might have been cooked something. It was literally, you could buy it or prepare it at home. This is an example of a modern day version of what the subject is. You could go to a little shop, buy this thing, put it out and have a look, and the birds would come down and eat it. Now, I thought this was a quaint, old-fashioned ritual that probably still practiced maybe in some outback Indian villages, and maybe not such a big a deal. Literally a week ago, I was in India, in Jaipur, and I went for a walk because I was at a literary festival. I went for a walk up the day afterwards, and to the local park in Jaipur, and I saw just ridiculous amounts of birds. And I thought, oh, this is great. There's more birds than I was expecting. And then I started to notice things like this dish hanging from the trees all around. And then I noticed little metal trays on the ground. And then I noticed huge numbers of people very quietly, inadvertently, piously, if you like, putting down seed and then walking off and putting down seed. And then I noticed that this bloody park was chock-a-block with birds feeding food that's put out by people in a vast scale. And I was completely wrong. This is not a remote ritual from the past. This is probably the biggest action of bird feeding happening in the world. If 1 billion people, or close to it, 1 billion people are doing this, I've missed something huge, and that's in India. And I put this up because you'll notice this is a map of where feeding is a big deal, slightly a big deal, or not at all. The grey is where I've found no examples of bird feeding on a regular basis. The red is, it's fairly regular, it happens a lot. The orange is where it's happening to a small extent, and the yellow is, it possibly could happen, and this was given to a bird industry where are the opportunities? The opportunities are in the yellow places. I missed completely India, which is just on a different scale altogether, but I just thought this is the first time I'm only back from India. I'm still reeling at that experience. I've got to find some Indian students to work with me on quantifying how much food is put out. Anyway, let's get going. This process, this daily putting out a little bit of food, started really simply in the 1980s. Pretty much the same time in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia and New Zealand. It was a very simple thing, which is to do it yourself. It was no big deal. Nobody did anything. They didn't spend any money. They might have rigged up something a bit simple like that, but it wasn't something that you did that cost money. You could do, simple platforms, chuck a bit of food. The food was either the leftover scraps from Sunday lunch, or the seed that you had for the budgies or the chooks. Nobody did anything. But by the end of the 80s, there was products available. And this has now expanded astronomically, incredibly, into a vast number of types of feed that's available and feeders. Just extraordinary hardware and software now available for what is now a truly gigantic industry worth $4 billion American dollars just in America alone. So it's a gigantic industry that nobody's even looking at. It's really quite extraordinary. This is a modern, the latest iteration of the first hanging feeder that was put out in America. It's pretty much the same thing. It's a transparent tube that the birds and the humans can see how much food's in there. They have a little perch, they stick their head in there and they get the food. And that was a total revolution because it was safe, it was easy to work out how much food to put in there. The squirrels couldn't get at it. They thought that's wrong. Squirrels can get into anything. And that's where it began. And then they went, if people would buy that, maybe they'll buy anything, and they do. So this is the Crystal Dome. I think you all should order one of these this afternoon. It's only cost you £750 plus postage, but people, buy them. Extraordinary. I was taken on a tour of the largest place where this is, where these things are manufactured and then distributed in the world. It's in Shropshire in England, and they send stuff everywhere throughout Europe and the world. It is absolutely mind-boggling, just the scale on which these sort of things are occurring. They're making food in 12 different languages to send out to all over the place. I mean, it's seriously beyond comprehension how big a scale it is.
Looks like lots of birds would fly into the glass and end up dead on their own.
Probably, yeah. But yeah, that's right. Yes, because that's covered, right?
Yeah.
Your bird can't fly in there.
It's got to go up and up.
Yeah. That wasn't mentioned in the fine print. I said to my tour guide...
You want a really close look at this bird, buy this and you can have a look.
Yeah, that's right. Close look as they twitch in their final death throes. But I said to my guide, this is unbelievable. What's the craziest thing that you sell here? And he said, probably this, which is the French version. So this is organic hedgehog pate. It's not made of hedgehogs, it's for hedgehogs. But he said to me that my guide at this company said, can you believe it? People buy this stuff. And he said it's cat food with a different label. So anyway, let's not go down that. So that's all background. You should hopefully you've gone, whoa, this is a bit strange. Let's now look at some of the science. So what happens? What's the result of all this? Because I've claimed in a number of publications that this is a truly gigantic supplementary feeding experiment on a global scale that nobody's taking any notice of. One of the reasons for the book is because though people are really passionate about their feeding, every individual household is concentrating on their backyard and their birds. But they don't realise that all up there on their street and throughout their city and throughout their entire country, the same thing is happening. What's going on? That's really where I got into this as an urban ecologist. I was studying the birds in my city, Brisbane, and I was finding everywhere I went, everything that I tried to do in terms of studying the ecology of the urban birds was being screwed up by the fact that people were providing food instead of just the birds weren't feeding naturally. So I was forced, sort of kicking and screaming, into taking notice of the bird feeding, and that's where this whole thing began. So let's go look through a couple of things. You will surely be aware that there are supplementary feeding experiments have been done on literally thousands of species across the board. I'm going to just horribly summarise the effects of thousands of studies, which you can look up in reviews, in an appallingly simplistic way. Basically, what these studies are shown, and this is done in natural circumstances where small amounts, usually of very strictly controlled amounts of food, are provided for birds in natural settings at different times in the breeding season to see what the effect is. It might be how much protein there is, how much scale there is, how much whatever it might be, and they're trying to see what's the effect of more protein, more fat, less fat, all that sort of stuff on the breeding outcomes. And so to summarise all of those things, basically there are three things of relevance to this talk. whenever you provide food, pretty much across the board, literally, the birds, or whatever the animals are, will start breeding earlier than they normally do, sometimes as early as 3 weeks earlier than normal. They will have more breeding attempts per breeding season, and that will lead to more offspring surviving. So feeding leads to more birds every time. It's just across the board. So we can expect that. If there's feeding in backyards is a global experiment, we can expect big changes to urban populations of birds. No question about that. Let's just see what. So to summarise what that's saying is, additional food always changes something. It's not trivial. Something big happens. Let's look at some of those things. Let's just look at some really basic stuff to begin with. So when we put out feeders, and the feeder can be two things. It's the people providing the food, and it's also the structure that the people. So feeders put out feeders. Do you get me? So, but when I mean feeders here, I mean the structures hanging from a tree with food in it. The more of those, the more birds. So this is just a very simple graph. This is feeder density, and this is the mean avian density. So just the number of individuals per square kilometre. This is the number of feeders per square kilometre. Note, 2,000 feeders per square kilometre in parts of the United States. 2,000 feeders. The ridiculously strong relationship. Just more feeders, more birds. More birds, but not more species. So I'm superimposed this. This is not the real data, because that's about individuals, not species. But in every case that I've looked at, the number of species goes down when you put out more feeders. So one of the arguments that lots of people who support very strongly the reasons for feeding is they say it supports conservation. It's about enhancing populations of birds and communities of birds in urban environments. But not necessarily. If there's just too much, you get tons of whatever the bird is, but not more species. It actually can decrease the biodiversity in urban environments. But it depends entirely on how many feeders there are, the diversity of food, and other aspects that we'll go into. A very simple study. This one's just come out probably late last year, and this is simply to say that likely it's to win the race. So one of the things about bird feeding that is truly unnatural is that the feeder is the only place where multiple species aggregate together to feed and compete over a food source. That simply doesn't happen on a regular basis, on a daily basis, if you like. There is almost no situation apart from, scavenging at a dead animal carcass or something like that, where multiple species will all get together in one place to compete for the foraging resource that's there. And so that leads to all kinds of things which we'll get to. But one of them is massive amounts of aggression. So this is simply saying, it's just data to show what everybody knows. The bigger birds get most of the food and the littler birds get the least food. So, and that's, you don't even need to know what they are, although that's a house sparrow at the top, and coal tit on the bottom, who get basically nothing. So they try and everyone beats them up. That's just a data to show something that's going on. One tiny example, but a spectacular example, is on blackcats. So this is a warbler, a famous warbler that breeds in Central Europe, especially around Germany. Now, what normally happens in winter is the German blackcaps typically go down to Spain or sometimes into North Africa to get away from the cold, as it normally happens. But there's always been a population, a section of the population which strangely went northeast, not down to get away from the cold. It actually went across the channel to parts of Great Britain. And that's been noted for a long time, at least since the 1950s and 60s, where bird watchers in Great Britain would note blackcaps turning up in England. It would have made no sense to do that because it's not any warmer where they're going. But that coincided, and that was noted in the 60s, but around about that time, this was after that, in the 80s and 90s, of course, the proportion of numbers of backyards with feeders started to go really up like anything. And the temperatures increased. So at the same time, it wasn't actually much colder. And when the birds arrived in Great Britain, they found lots and lots of feeders. It's winter, so let's not see so much as suet, so fat, high amounts of concentrated fat that they can get, which is all over the place in winter. As a result, these birds that went to, which seem to be counterintuitive and not very adaptive, they actually went the shorter distance to England, got in better condition than the ones that went to Spain, because in Spain there was no bird feeding so much. These guys came in better condition. They came back earlier to the breeding season at the end of, for spring, arrived weeks earlier in better condition, and got the girls bred earlier, pumped out the babies, and have completely swamped the gene pool. So now these aberrant birds are now the common birds in Germany.
Sorry, while you're still on this one, you can understand why they liked the conditions when they got to Britain.
Yeah.
How do you account for the fact that they travelled in the direction of Britain in the first place?
That is still nobody knows. You know, they were regarded as seriously aberrant. You know, there was no particular reason for them to do that. Have you ever heard the reason, Rich, why the blackcaps went there in the first place?
I think really there's just a bit of variation, really. So
Does
some.
this mean potentially every year there's actually a handful that go in every direction?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
They just
More or less
usually
like
end
that.
up just dying?
Yeah.
That's right, yeah. And it's just that there was very keen birdos watching them and recording them in Britain that we noticed. But probably it's the same with everything. You know, they're all just spreading out. Most of them go in the right direction, thankfully, and some don't. And you know, some would go
Some
north
get
into the
lucky.
cold. Yeah, so
So it's sort of pudding?
yeah, absolutely. Of a kind of evolutionary thing that's occurring. There are other examples which I'm not going to talk about. There is actually very strong evidence that the size, width, and length of birds that feed in bird feeders has changed in a 20-year period, because they need to have thinner. The birds that get seeds out of feeders can actually get more feed if they've got this thinner, longer bill, which is another story altogether. I'll just go straight to this one, because this is the #1 concern around the world. If you ask people who are opposed to feeding or those who strongly favour feeding, if you ask anybody what's your biggest concern about what might be happening if you feed birds, they all say, well, maybe the birds are going to be dependent on this food. What if they can't? They just totally forget about how to find food. What if they're completely reliant on the feeder, and we can't? You get sick one weekend and you go away, and they all just starve to death, like worst case scenario. Well, this is where it really began for me, because we were already studying magpies for other reasons in the suburbs of Brisbane, and we found everywhere we went that the magpies were eating stuff, you know, mince and chopped heart and diced liver and all these sorts of things that the people were providing for the magpies. So we thought this might be a chance to see whether the magpies are actually dependent on the food that we're providing. So we had 20 pairs of magpies which were being fed, and we compared those 20 pairs of another 20 pairs of magpies which weren't being fed. And so this is just a very brief summary of a large study that we did, just to show you. These are the fed pairs. So these ones have got access to lots of artificial food provided by humans. These birds are unfed. The blue is the proportion of natural food. So even though, and so these birds have got hungry, starving, ravenous magpie babies back in the nest. We assumed that they would simply cut their losses and just ferry beakfuls of mince back to the chicks, because it's impossible to keep up with these starving big babies. But they didn't do that. 70% of the food they provided, even though they could have gone just over the road to Mrs. Smith's meat tray, didn't do that. 70% of their food was still natural. Now that was the first time that anybody had showed that, and I've followed that up with lots of people around the world, and it's pretty much the same sort of thing. Even where there is access to bird feeders, very strong access to bird feeders, in virtually every case that anybody's looked at, the most of the food provided for the chicks is the natural food, which is really reassuring for those people who are really worried about whether it's the right food to use. So even though feeders are everywhere, and the birds wouldn't need to ever go out and forage for natural food, across the board, except in extreme circumstances when it's really cold or really difficult, the birds are still getting the natural stuff, which is really good. So I concluded a couple of things. For magpies at least, natural food is preferred. I think that's true across the board for lots of different species. And, you know, it seems that the parents have a no junk food policy. So this was a first attempt to try and find out whether the birds were dependent. And I'm just using my example, but there are many other examples which show that to not be the case. So the birds are not dependent on the food we provide. Very important finding. What I did find was there is strong evidence that the people are totally and utterly addicted to feeding. They can't give up whether they try to. And I can genuinely tell you that I know many, many people who've said, I haven't been able to go on holidays for 12 years because the birds will starve to death. They seriously, and I do a lot of counselling over the phone, you know. Mrs. Smith, look, I don't know how to tell you, but your magpies feed at 6 other ladies' meat trays up your street, and in fact they don't need you at all. Oh, but I never say that. But that's a really important thing. So that's probably the strongest thing in terms of the management of this issue to come out of this work across the board. The birds don't become dependent on the food. Now I'm going to tell you, they do become dependent on the food in certain circumstances. What's wrong with this photo? This is a hummingbird in snow. It should never happen. Why is it happening? Because this is a feeder with a built-in warmer that keeps the sugar water from freezing. And so birds like honey eaters can go, hummingbirds, can go to Vancouver and stay all winter. Completely insane. If that feeder doesn't work, or the people can't feed it, or it blows off, those birds are utterly dependent on that food. And not only that, there is no other food for them to get. They should be feeding on insects, you know, like all sugar eaters, honey eaters, sugar birds, hummingbirds, the lot. You can't live on sugar. Tell that to the teenagers. But you can't live on sugar. You've got to have a protein diet. Those birds, there's no protein in the middle of winter in Vancouver. And so those birds, nobody's done that study, but it needs to be done. So in certain circumstances, that can happen, and that's not a good thing. How are we going for time? How much?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, fine. I'll just quickly finish up with a couple of things. The other big concern is disease. As I've said already, we concentrate very artificially lots of birds in one location. And if there's going to be disease spread, that's obvious. There's no mystery about that at all. If there are infectious birds and they're all meeting together in one place, that's where you're going to spread. It's just going to happen, and it does happen. So the most famous example is the house finch disease, a conjunctivitis caused by this mycoplasma. And this was recorded in tremendous amounts of detail by the Lab of Ornithology in the United States, because there is a thing called Project Feeder Watch, where people every month watch all the birds at their feeders, send in data. It's a massive amount of data. It's an incredible resource. But what they were able to do was map in incredible detail the kilometre by kilometre spread of that disease through the 1990s and early 2000s as it spread through the thing. Now the real irony is they were able to map the disease. The disease wouldn't have happened if the feeders weren't there. It's, you know, like the feeders that you're watching with the disease is only happening because, you know, but you can't say that. Anyway, in the United Kingdom, it's similar type of thing. So this is a green finch. There's a couple of others. There's a dunnock and a red pole, chaffinch. The red is the green finch. So the green finch wasn't doing too well a couple of ages ago. But when a new type of little seed called Niger was introduced, a very small but oil-rich type of seed. The green finches, and that's an American goldfinch, but these green finches in the United Kingdom went berserk. They absolutely loved it. And their populations rapidly increased until this moment in 2006, where there was a disease spread among the feeders, among the birds visiting the feeders, and the population absolutely plummeted. Absolutely plummeted downwards. And I got 2017 data just the other day, and it's gone down to here. So there has been, what is it, a 65% decrease in the population in less than 10 years in that, directly as a result of a feeder spread disease. So this is the biggest concern. This one is a general concern. So the two big ones were dependency and disease. Dependency we found not to be a concern. This is the concern. This is absolutely incredibly important. Now, interestingly, the Americans have refuse to take it seriously. They don't kind of acknowledge that result at all. It's really interesting. Might have something to do with how much the industry runs the industry. The industry runs the industry in America. They don't want anybody to stop buying their food. However, in Great Britain, I can say that when this became clear, the BTO and all those other groups went very strongly, this is a problem, and here's how you must clean your feeders from now on. Very simple, very strict rules about what you need to do to avoid this problem at your place. And they, advocated stop feeding completely for a month. We know that's not going to be a problem for the birds. Again, it's not not during winter, like when the birds really might need that food to a certain extent. But they were very proactive and very different response. And I'll finish up with this. In Australia, so here is 3 of the typical birds from the Northern Hemisphere. Black-capped chickadee, blue tit, and American goldfinch. Little birds. In Australia, we've got rainbow lorikeets, kookaburras, and magpies. Can you see any difference there? The other thing is, these 2 don't eat seed at all. They eat meat. And so, when I give talks like this in Europe, they are absolutely shocked. The majority of birds, so the magpie is the most commonly fed bird in Australia, and the most of the food that it eats obviously is meat. So, it's not seed, it's meat. Plenty of seed goes out there, but it's just a very big issue. So it's a totally different aspect here. It's very, very different. So what I'm going to finish up here with is just a couple of comments now. Because of those, the attitudes that I mentioned earlier on about how negative it is in Australia, it is normal for people to assume, if you have any sort of interest in environment or conservation, that you will oppose bird feeding. And because I didn't come out and say bird feeding is absolutely terrible in this book, I have been seriously trolled by all sorts of people. One of my favourite quotes is, Darryl Jones to Australian ecology is like Donald Trump to politics, which is fantastic. You put that in your CV for sure. But I've got a lot of career advice about what I should be doing with my but so this book has done actually very well, much more surprisingly. I thought it'd sell in the United States, and it has done. I didn't expect it to do so well here. It's doing really, really well here. But the publishers just went, you know what you have to do? Because I would give talks to this. I gave lots and lots of talks like this, 36 talks last year after the book came out around Australia. And people didn't talk about, the blue tits or the ibis mummies. They said, what do I then do? You mean we're allowed to talk about bird feeding now? Is that true? I feed the birds? This comes up all the time. So at one of these things, the publisher of the book was there to see this happen. And she said, you know what you've got to do now? You've got to pump out a book as soon as you possibly can on how to feed birds in Australia sustainably and ecologically sensibly. And that's what I've just done. So that book's just been delivered to them somehow, and in a year I wrote another one. It's not a massive thing like that. It's a book called Feeding the Birds at Your Table, and that will be the next thing to come out. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So yeah, that was a fantastic talk. I just sort of wanted to ask a question. So your presentation obviously spanned a couple of different body sizes and also preferences, specifically with these guys eating meat versus seed.
Yep.
And you talked about the negative effects of dependency, potentially more offspring and things like that. Now, if you think about it in an African context, and even in the South American context, we have really sort of dramatic examples of birds being harvested for the parrot trade.
Yeah, right.
With vultures in Africa, you've got this massive continent-wide decline because of the poisoning of these animals for the traditional medicine trade.
Yep.
Now, in South Africa specifically, there's a couple of organisations that have these vulture restaurants where they sort of try and keep these vulture colonies around. And I mean, in that context, if you didn't have them, those things would be bloody gone.
Oh, no, absolutely.
They'd go completely extinct. And the same with like African greys in Angola. So what I wanted to know is what do you think about sort of actively trying to feed larger sized body birds in South America and in parts of Africa where they're getting sort of actively harvested.
No, that's an incredibly important point. My primary focus in this talk and most of the book is about the suburban environment, like people's backyards. That's where. But there's an entire chapter in there on using feeding for conservation, and so there's huge numbers, especially in places like New Zealand. There is enormous supplementary projects, complete supplementary feeding projects, completely associated with the conservation of species. There are many examples like the ones you gave of providing supplementary food for endangered or threatened or declining populations, especially of birds of prey, absolutely. There's the really spectacular example in Great Britain of the red kites. I mean, you can go to a place called Gigran Farm, which is in the southern part of England, and you can see on any particular day 8,000 red kites. Now, red kites used to be extinct. Just 100 years ago they were extinct in England. Now they're absolutely everywhere, and you can go and see these things. So these things can be done very carefully and sensibly, and so that's completely acceptable. You always come into problems with generalisations, and there are some really important exceptions. There are some very serious exceptions to the birds don't become dependent on the food, especially in winter. There's lots of examples of that sort of thing where the feeder provides something so artificial that the birds have stopped migrating. It happens as well. So, yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah?
What about giving the edge to the big bullies in Australia?
Yeah.
Is that a thing that does happen?
Yes, it does. I mean, the biggest bullies, of course, are noisy miners, and they don't go to feeders, but they do go to sugar water things. So there is still a vast number of people who make their own sugar water or honey water and put it out for the honey eaters, and you get noisy miners instead. Don't forget though, the reason that we've got so many, this is now the most abundant urban bird in Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne and Perth, where it's been introduced, and Townsville, entirely because of the choices of plants that people have put in their gardens. And we have put in nectar-bearing plants in order to attract the birds. And in almost every case you get rainbow lorikeets and noisy miners and zilch else. So it's not, so one of the things I go strongly for is if we are interested in conservation of urban birds, we have to go way beyond the feeder. We are already providing a feeder in the form of nectar-bearing plants in a large way. We have to have a much more diverse set of foods that we provide. And so in this new book that comes out, it's completely about, think about your garden as habitat, not just a place where birds can come to feed. It needs structure, it needs a very wide range of food, and never too much as well. Yeah. Rich?
You drew an interesting contrast between the attitudes of different ornithological organisations, right, around the world. Any progress in attitudinal change within the Australian?
Yes. So Australia, the peak ornithological group or bird watching group in Australia is called BirdLife Australia, and the new CEO is an Englishman. You know him, and he doesn't come with the baggage that everybody else has. So we are literally right now working on guidelines for Australian birds. So when that comes out, when the peak bird group can come out and say, all right, we understand what's going on, we need to have some guidelines. So I've tried to argue this, and I should have said this earlier. To me now, what I know about bird feeding in Australia is not what has happened in the past has been, let's just completely ignore it. Let's just completely ignore it. To me now, because I know what's going on, and because you know what's going on now, this is now a strongly ethical position that I have to take. Because I don't want these birds that I really value and treasure in Australia to be harmed, and because there's been no advice about what bird feeders should provide, and they're providing terrible stuff in all sorts of demonstrable ways, we have to engage with all those people feeding birds to provide the best possible information on how to do it properly. Now, we're totally behind the eight ball here because there's been decades of research done in the United States and Great Britain on what's appropriate and how much and what to do and how much do you need and all those sorts of things. There's been absolutely nothing done in Australia, and yet we've got these kinds of birds. It's not going to be the same thing. You can't just transport blue tit food over here and put it in a feeder. Nothing's going to happen. There's no blue tits, and birds can't use feeders anyway. Although I do know of some self-crested cockatoos who went to a feeder, like a very expensive crystal feeder, and just chomped it in half. and so they just chomped it in half, and then all the food went onto the ground. Yes?
I saw some media coverage maybe 6 months ago all about how people feeding magpies scraps of meat is leaving them with babies with weak bones and things like that. Is there actually any evidence about that, or is it sometimes just someone with a particular...
No, that is potentially a problem. It's potentially a problem. That's what the vets say. So the vets are seriously, they're my biggest problem, because they come out, they look after only those birds which are really in terrible condition, and they come into the thing. There is evidence from zoos and from veterinary research that whatever animal that is a predator or carnivorous animal doesn't just eat meat. You know, if you're a lion, you eat fur and bones and brains and organs and the whole lot. And that is actually well balanced. It produces all the right balances of the chemicals that you need. If you only, for example, eat meat, like mince, which is the commonest bird food put out for magpies, that's way too low in calcium. And if you ate too much of that, and that's been shown in experimental studies, if you only eat meat and nothing else, the calcium that they require to build their bones will be taken out of their bones, and if they're young animals, they can have warped and weak bones. So potentially that's true. What probably isn't happening on a really wide scale, because we would see it more often, is because the adult birds aren't providing all mince, they're getting plenty of natural food as well. So there will be examples, there will be some examples where some lazy parents, magpies, are just providing all mince, but it's not going to be very rare. Yes?
So I think that you need to come out with a magpie pate.
Magpie pate? No. Well, don't tell anybody, but I'm working quietly with Mars Australia, Mars is the biggest pet food company in Australia, so they make just about every sort of pet food that you buy in the shops is made by Mars. And they're actually, don't tell anybody, but they're making Maggie meals, which is going to be artificial worms, which are like, find a worm, work out what it's made of, and then make an artificial worm, and then sell it. So you'll be able to buy Maggie meals in the supermarkets shortly, which, good luck to them, because mince is a lot cheaper. Yep.
Thanks for the talk. If there are more birds because of the feeders, might it have a negative impact on insect populations, or?
Yeah, no, that actually has been looked at. Yes, no. Well, at least in the vicinity of the feeder. I mean, because the birds are being brought into the feeder, they hang around the feeder. So, like that graph I showed you with 12 species of birds which would like to feed on the feeder, but only the big ones get the chance. They're hanging around in the desperate hope that they might get some feed sometime, and they're also feeding on the insects which within that vicinity. That's been looked at in a fair bit of detail, but it looks like that doesn't have an effect. But it's possible. And we are worried about the insects increasingly at the moment. So, yeah.
What does the fat in the mince do to the birds?
The fat's not too much of a problem. Yeah, no, not too much of a problem. It does increase their cholesterol. So if you eat only, there was a great study done by people from UQ at Gatton who took magpies and fed them only salami. I'm not sure why, but they fed them salami for a year, and their cholesterol levels went through the roof. What are you going to, that's not a surprise. But there are people who specialise on salami. I know of one guy an old gentleman whose wife feeds the magpies, and he sold it. She buys diced liver and heart for the magpies. I get sausages, he told me. So, yeah.
I throw them insects out of my compost.
Very good. Perfect. That's very good. Yeah, you can't...
From gardening, I can't help it.
Yeah, no, well, that's right.
Get some bugs out of the compost bin.
Yep.
Given that, talking about magpies and kookaburras and these large sort of carnivorous birds, do you think developing aggressive behaviours in birds is an issue of feeding in Australia? Because just anecdotally, like my neighbour was feeding magpies and now we can't eat outside because we get about 10 magpies all surrounding our deck and swooping at my toddler.
Yeah. That brings in the whole magpie aggression thing. One of the things that of course, if I'm going to do these kind of talks and I'm talking to a general audience, I finish up with a whole lot of, so here, now that we know all this, here's things that you really should know about what to do. And one of the first things I say is never too much. The final slide says, it's too many ahead because we didn't have 3 hours to talk, but it says, we think the feeders are for the birds, the feeders are actually for us. We have to face that fact. Humans feed birds for our sake, not for the birds' sake. We just want to enjoy them, we want them to come up close, and there's the final chapters in the book are all about the many, many incredible benefits from being in nature, and the simple ability to feed birds in your own backyard brings nature to you. That connection with nature is probably the most important thing of all. Not all this negative stuff, it's all this stuff. And so if that can be done properly and carefully and sustainably, that can be really strong. But one of the things we have to overcome is putting out too much food. And so that's why you've got all those magpies coming. They will aggressively compete for all the food. And because lots of people who feed the birds, they think, oh, they're all starving, they really need the food, I'll put out more tomorrow. That never ends. Yeah. So probably all of us know of somebody, usually elderly, who's putting out way too much food, and now there's 70 magpies sitting over here watching. I mean, seriously, there are plenty of places in Brisbane where that's the case. I know a lady who feeds ibis, and she isn't very popular with her neighbours. I mean, seriously, there are 120 ibis in her backyard in a suburban environment. The things that I say are never too much. It's a snack. It's like a cup of tea and a Tim Tam, not a 3-course meal. And then I have to say, but don't feed them Tim Tams. Yep.
What about the angle that my parents feed magpies, and I think that if they didn't have that little interaction with an animal regularly and the magpie sitting around and wobbling on their railing, I think they'd go out and buy a cat or a dog.
Yeah. So, that's what I'm saying. I think this, let me step back.
There might be quite a lot of people who would actually go out and have introduced animals
if
they didn't have that interaction.
I get accused of actually, the reason I get trolled and have interesting comments about my vocation is because of it. It seems that I'm suggesting that people should feed birds, and I don't in the book at all. Yeah. I am now. I'm actually suggesting that people should feed birds. I've said it. I've said it. Okay. I'm coming out with it now. Well, I've got to sell this other book, haven't I? But I'm actually saying that properly done, this could be a really, really beneficial, important way to interact with nature in a simple way, as long as we take some simple rules and not do it too badly. So I agree entirely. And the relationship, people act, let's be honest, I'm going to say something about British bird feeders here. You can't have a relationship with a blue tip. You just can't. You can have a deep, passionate relationship with a magpie. Now those magpies that come to your place or your grandma's place or wherever, they are the same magpies that have been there for 20 years. They saw you grow up, they saw your kids grow up, they know you individually. Each year, the parent magpies bring the next year's offspring. That is a truly profound interaction and relationship that people are having with their magpies. The magpie thing is a really profound Australian experience that people have in their own backyards. And you tell those people, you shouldn't feed the magpies, it's really bad, they just say, you have no idea what you're talking about. You prove to me that you have no idea and you simply don't care. So that's why, again, I'm trying to say, this knowledge is got to be used to reach out to the people who are feeding the birds, because there can be some really profoundly important positive things to come out of this relationship. And maybe I better leave it there because we're probably way out of time. I do have a few copies of the book. Anyway. Is that it?
Well, there is one more. What about knock-on effects? I just wonder if you'd include that in your second book, because we've got neighbours who like to put seed out for the king parrots. That falls down. Oh dear, I think we're getting rats. So then the rat sack has to come out on the ground.
Absolutely. So that's why you never put too much out. So, and cleaning, I don't need to, because you people don't feed birds, I know that, so you don't need to know these things, but there are 4 or 5 little simple rules. One of them is, if you're going to feed, you're going to take the responsibility to feed the birds at my table. If you had friends of family coming to your place to feed, to eat with you at your table, you would make sure the table was really, and the plate was really, really clean. You wouldn't want them to be eating the wrong stuff or getting disease, would you? You know, so that's the way we should be treating the thing. So keeping it clean, picking up the scraps, designing it so that you can actually make sure that there's no vermin anywhere near it, all that sort of stuff is crucial, truly essential. The problem in Australia is that we haven't been allowed to talk about it. It's been a forbidden subject, seriously. And I've kicked open this door and said, it's all right, let's start talking about it. Because we're decades behind the rest of the world. And we have to start talking about these things because we've got totally different birds. Thank you.